All right, ladies and gentlemen. So for the next 4 units, the most important graph that we need to understand to be able to manipulate is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and walk us through how to draw it, what's going to change the shape, and kind of what we're trying to find and look at when we look at this graph. So when we're starting out, right, we're going to draw our axes just as you would with your basic supply and demand graph. Along the x-axis, we're going to do our real GDP. This is our total output in our economy. Total number of goods and services. Okay. On the y-axis, we're going to put PL for price level, meaning at this level of prices, what would be our total output? So start with our aggregate demand curve. So our aggregate demand curve is going to be downward sloping because at the higher prices, you're going to be producing less because it's more expensive to produce and buy stuff. And at the lower prices, you're going to be demanding more goods and services because it's cheaper to do so, right? This is a micro concept that we've talked about, and now we're taking it up to that macro level, right? So we'll label that curve AD for aggregate demand. Now remember, aggregate demand in this case is always going to equal our total GDP. And our GDP equals, remember, our consumption plus our investment spending plus our government spending plus our net exports. Right? So if you see AD, if I say real GDP, or if I say one of these components, you know I'm talking about the same thing. So let's add our short run aggregate supply. So our aggregate supply curve in the short run is going to curve up. We're going to label it short run aggregate supply. And this is our total goods and services willingly supplied. And so we're talking about producers here. What are producers willing to produce at any price level in your economy, right? We're not talking about just one good, we're talking about total goods and services, so everything in your economy, okay? So these are the two components we need as this kind of looks like just our micro level supply and demand. So let me add one more component that's going to change it up. So we're going to draw a vertical curve. We're going to label this your long run aggregate supply. So the long run AS is vertical because this is fixed. What is fixed, you may ask? Your resources, right? So in the long run, we can only produce a certain number of goods because our resources are fixed. So let's just hypothetically say our LRAS represents 100 resources. We only have 100 resources at this point. And so we can only produce and maintain the production level at that point for in the long run because we do not have more resources. So, but then you may ask, well, Mr. Hoskins, what happens if your aggregate demand curve and your short run aggregate supply curve intersect here? Well, that's past the long run aggregate supply. How can you produce past your long run aggregate supply? Then you're producing with resources you don't have. Good question, I say. Well, let's see what happens here. Well, number one, let's see. Our price level went from here to here, so now we have an inflationary gap where prices are high. And that's how you do this, right? The price is forced up by this increase in aggregate demand, while at the same time we have a shortage in the supply. Now you can produce in the short run past your long run, but that's going to mean higher prices because it costs more to get the raw resources to make them, whether it be labor, whether it be the actual physical raw resources. And this is an unsustainable amount of production. Eventually, something needs to change. The prices will get so high that it will kill the demand and swing you back to equilibrium, right? And so you can produce beyond your capabilities, but not for long periods of time. The only way you can sustain production here at this point would be to shift your long-run aggregate supply over. And how can you shift that? New resources. Things like increased people, population, increased productivity, and increased efficiency. Not until you get those things can you produce and maintain production at those levels. Okay, so on the next slide, I will take a look at what's going to shift our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply. All right, so when we're talking about shifting our aggregate supply and our aggregate demand, the things that are going to shift them are going to be very similar to the things that would shift our demand and our supply on the micro level, right? So when we're talking about things that are going to shift our aggregate supply, what do I mean by shift? Shift meaning increase or decrease our aggregate supply. So what would be some things that would increase our aggregate supply? Well, as we know, aggregate supply is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX, meaning consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. So let's deal with the main component of this, which would be consumption. So what would increase consumption? Things that would increase our disposable income. If you have more money, you're going to consume more, right? So anything that would increase your disposable income, things like a decrease in taxes, increase in wages, or an increase in your wealth, right? Because remember, wealth and income are not the same thing. Wealth is an accumulation of your assets. Your income is what you get paid every month, right? So if your house goes up in price by 200%, you're going to be able to spend more money, right? So that would all increase your aggregate demand because of consumption. Now, just flip everything around if we want to see what's going to happen. What would decrease our aggregate demand, right? A decrease in disposable income, which would lead to a decrease in consumption. So the convex side of that would be an increase in taxes. Something that would cause your wages to go down, right? So a labor surplus, and maybe a housing crisis, which would cause your wealth to decrease, right? So any point on the consumption line there is going to increase or decrease our consumption. Now, you can also talk about investment. What's going to shift your investment? Investment is all about interest rates. So, increase in interest rates are going to decrease your investment. All right? If it's more expensive to borrow money, you're going to borrow less. If the interest rates go down, then you're going to invest more. It's cheaper to do so, right? And pretty much that's the main driver of what's going to be driving investment. Government spending, right? So if we change our government spending, so increase our government spending on things like roads, military, things like that, that can increase your aggregate demand. What is not included in here are transfer payments. Transfer payments are not included in your aggregate demand because aggregate demand is representative of production. When you receive a transfer payment like a food stamps or welfare benefits, you are not doing any production, thus it doesn't get calculated in. But anything that represents production, roads, military, infrastructure spending, is all counted in aggregate demand. Now, let's take a look at our exports and our imports. So, our net exports, any increase in exports will have a positive shift of the aggregate demand curve, and any increase in imports will have a negative impact on aggregate demand. Why? If we're exporting more, that means more people are buying goods from the United States, and that means more people in the United States are getting wages, thus more money is flowing through the economy. Flip that over, if we're importing more, we're taking money out of our economy and giving it to China, Vietnam, and less money is circulating through our economy and our wages, so that will have a negative impact. So in the next video I will show you what shifts the aggregate supply curve. Again, very similar to things we've seen before, but it is imperative that you know how to do this and do it well. All right, guys, see you later.